Okay, today we are going to be looking at geography of Mesopotamia and Egypt. Um, when we look at the geography, we'll see some things that really stick out about how secure one is over the other. Here is the Fertile Crescent. Now, the Fertile Crescent's important. It's called the Fertile Crescent because I've had a crescent roll. I love crescent rolls. But a crescent is this C shape, okay? And it goes from the Persian Gulf all the way up and over the top, following the Tigris and Euphrates, and then down along the Palestinian coast. And if you were going to travel between Mesopotamia and Egypt, that's the direction you travel. You would not travel straight across the Syrian desert. Even in modern days, the Syrian desert is very deadly. Um, it is hot, it is dry, and it's not a very habitable place. Another thing I want you to notice too is you see this blue line out here in the Persian Gulf. That is the modern day coastline. And so as the Tigris and Euphrates rivers aged, it pumped silt into this area and it filled this area in with land. This picture of this man down here on the boat is a person down in southeastern Iraq. Um, it used to be famous for its marshes and the marsh people that lived out there. But the marshes were filled in by Saddam Hussein when they revolted against him in the early 90s. He did that to wipe that culture out. Now, um, so this is now dry land, and the Tigris and Euphrates actually meet up and join each other, and as they float into the Persian Gulf. So the ancient coastline is quite a ways up. Now, another thing you should pay attention to is the scale. Okay, I don't have a way to measure with my mouse, but 300 miles is about, well, on my computer here, on my screen, it's about an inch and a quarter or so. And so this is a couple hundred miles of land that has filled in since ancient times. Okay. Again, the ancient trade routes would take you up along the Tigris and Euphrates, up in modern day Syria. Then you can come down along the coast to make it over to Egypt. Because of the dryness and the dangers of the desert, you wouldn't travel straight across. Now, another thing here is something else to look at. Okay. Again, we have the ancient coastline down here, although they don't have it marked on this one. But here are cities across ancient Mesopotamia. And in ancient times, these cities would be their own countries, essentially, where they would run a city state. And eventually, if they had the power, they might be able to conquer other city states. Now, you might recognize some of these city states or cities. We haven't talked about any of these yet. But Uruk is that kingdom of Gilgamesh. Is a city we'll talk about coming up. Babylon, Nineveh. Um, these are all ancient cities that dominated at different times. Now, looking at the scale again, 1 to 200 miles up here. Okay, it is a couple hundred miles across, and so these rivers would support small cities, and you'd have a broad swath of territory. Now, what that did for the people of Mesopotamia is if you lived in Akkad, and Akkadians were a major civilization back then. But if you were an Akkadian emperor like Sargon, if you lived in Akkad, you could be attacked by any of the cities around you. And it would be difficult to defend yourself. And so a lot of these cities will be walled cities. The ancient Greeks from about 400 BC or 300 BC, they talk about camping along some of these city walls. Some of the descriptions they have are pretty incredible, where the city wall might be 80 miles long on one side. We would have to take that with a grain of salt, and actually, we have no way to verify those things. But they did talk about walls being 80 feet tall, miles and miles in circumference. and they were only supposing what was on the other side of that city. So the cities in Mesopotamia could have dangers from any side. Okay. Now, again, not crossing the Syrian desert because that would be a very dangerous way to go. But you have this broad highway following the Tigris and Euphrates all the way up to Asia Minor, which is modern day Syria and Turkey. And so this area here was an area where you would get a rise of different kingdoms or empires. Okay, this one too, another one that kind of illustrates the closeness with Egypt, but also the diversity of people in this area. Babylonian Empire, it rises several times before it is lost to history. The Syrian Empire, their capital is Nineveh, but they dominated the ancient Near East about 700 BCE. Now, the Egyptians, okay, this map is kind of misleading, and we'll see why here in a second. Because of the broad swath of Egypt down here, again, look at the scale. Egypt does not have the width that Mesopotamia has. Egypt is long and narrow, and we'll see that here coming up. Okay, now this obviously is a modern day picture of Egypt and a map of Egypt. Egypt notoriously followed that Nile River Valley. Okay, and that Nile River Valley might be up to about 15 to 20 miles wide. Some places it's only a couple miles wide. Okay, and up at the top here, the delta, this is known as Lower Egypt. Lower means elevation. Okay, Upper Egypt is up in the mountains. Lower Egypt is down along the coast. But the delta is a lot of marshlands, and nowadays where the most population is. Now, this night vision of Egypt, this color over here, that's Israel. Here is that Nile River Delta right here. Okay, and you can follow it up. The Nile River comes right up here. This is a little knob that is right around near Thebes. Okay, Thebes right there, before it trails off through Elephantine and on up the Nile River. The reason I want to show you this is because how dark. There isn't really any civilization outside that Nile River. Okay, you'll have some swaths that follow some oases and some areas. But that is, again, this is a modern day picture from a satellite. Okay, and you also see some places along the coastline along the Red Sea. But along the Nile River, it is a one-way road. Okay, you have the Eastern Desert to the east, you have the Western Desert to the west, the Sahara Desert. It's very dangerous to cross. And so if you remember Mesopotamia, it had the Syrian Desert off to the west, but you could travel north and south along that Euphrates River, and it was a quite broad highway. Egypt's highway is very narrow and only up and down that Nile River. One of my favorite historical stories talks about a man named Cambyses. He came from Mesopotamia. He was a Persian king, and he tried to attack Egypt. And he actually lost 50,000 soldiers. His army was lost in the deserts around Egypt because he did take off through the desert. And his army's still out there. I'd love to find it someday. Of course, I'm out there digging right now. So, your assignment today. I left this on here. These are all pictures or things from your textbook. Look at topography, and the question is, how is Mesopotamia more vulnerable or more exposed compared to Egypt, and how might that develop or show in their development of civilizations? Okay, will one be continuous or more fragmented? And don't stress about the answer too much, but give me your best answer. If you have any questions, shoot me an email.